Assalamu alaikum students, how are you all? Hope that you are having an amazing day. I am Muhammad Naeem Amin Bhatti and today the topic of our discussion is American poetry, Robert Frost and Acquainted with the Night. Basically our topic is divided into three major parts. The first part will describe you an introduction to the American poetry. The second part will describe you the biography and some works of Robert Frost, and in third part we will go through the Acquainted with the Night, a poem by Robert Frost. So let's start today's discussion. The first part of our lecture is Introduction to American Poetry. As we all know that the poetry is basically a sudden outlet of emotions, and due to this definition every nation wants that they should have their own cultural identity, they should have their own literary identity through the poetic works. That's why the proper definition of American poetry is that it is the poetry of the people of United States. So that poetry which was written by the writers of the United States, the poets of the United States, was called the American poetry. Basically, America was colonized by the British. Some parts were under the influence of the British government. In those parts there was New England, there was Vermont and many other parts and the states of United States of America. So it arises first in the efforts by the colonists to add their voices to English poetry in the 17th century. The colonization was completely done in America, and after the colonization, the British poetry set some type of influence on the people of America. So, before the constitutional amendments and the unification of the 13 colonies captured by the British government in America, the Americans were totally under the influence of the British poetry. From that poetry, they took an appreciation. From that poetry, they took some kind of indulgement in that poetry to write it down in their native English parameters. That's why before the unification, a strong oral traditions that was linked to the poetry existed among the Native American societies. It means that the American societies were following those rules which were given to them by the British poets at that time. I will give you reference from the British poetry, like Alfred Lord Tennyson was that time imitated a lot by the American poets. So how and when it was started? Most of the early colonists' work relied on the contemporary British models of the poetic form, diction and theme. Basically the poetic formations, the dictionary or the diction items, themes and vocabulary was taken from the British colonization literary terms and conditions. But in 19th century, distinctive American idiom began to emerge. The American language was a little bit different from the British language. Both of the language were used in the American poetry. But because of the influence of the British poetry, the American poetry setback was according to the people of America. And because it is a pure genre of literature, that's why poetry of that time was reflecting the mindset and the identity of the people of America at that time. By the later part of that century, when Walt Whitman was winning an enthusiastic audience abroad, poets from the United States has begun to take their places at the forefront of the English language. It means that English language was the basic tool to start up the American poetry in United States of America. Significant and the most famous early American poets, critics are divided in this point. At this point, A significant poet of the independent United States was William Cullen Bryant from 1794 to 1878. But some of the critics also thought that it was a mutual collaboration by the poets at that time. But the great contribution of W.C. Bryant was that to write the rhapsodic poems on the grandeur of prairies and forests. So it was a basic diction from the British poets that was followed by the first significant independent United States writer. However, the first internationally acclaimed poet was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow from 1807 to 1882. He nearly surpassed Alfred Lord Tennyson, one of the most British poet, as you have read about in the history of English literature. He was one of the main Victorian poets, one of the main early Victorian poets. But at that point, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who was an American poet, was surpassing Alfred Lord Tennyson at international level, at international popularity, at international poetical dictions and works, at international terms and conditions according to the American poetry and international level poetry. The other notable American poets at that time were William Cullen Bryant, John Greenleaf Whittier, James Russell Lowell, and Oliver Wendell Holmes. Some of these poets were making their contributions in the American poetry. The next one is the term fireside poets. That is a crazy type of term because people at that time used to listen the poetry from the other persons. They get together around a fire like the bonfire type, some kind of settlements. They sat around the fire, they assembled around the fire and used to listen that type of poetry, which was a habitual type of, which was a habitual for those peoples of America. So the fireside poets were a group of 19th century American poets from New England. I'm going to clear that basically New England was a state of America that was is such like that as the Vermont was the state of America. So New England was an American state, and here in New England the poetry was penetrating in the minds of the people. So the name fireside poet is derived from that popularity. Why? Because the people at that time used to sit around the fire and to listen to the poetical works of the poets at that time. So the general adherence to the poetic convention or the standard forms, regular meters, and rhyme stanzas made their body of work particularly suitable for the memorization and recitation in school and also at home. So that was a habit for the people for the sake of their restness, for the sake of peace of mind. They used to listen different poetic works, different type of poetry at home or at school. But the dimension was that, the tradition was that to sit around the fire and to listen to the poetry. So it was a source of entertainment for the families gathered around the fire. Therefore, the term at that time was coined, publicly was coined as the fireside poets. Now, the important point, the influence of transcendentalism. Transcendentalism basically is a philosophical movement that developed in the late 1820s and 1830s, the early part of the 19th century in the eastern United States. It arose the reaction to protest against the general state of the intellectualism and spirituality at that time. Somehow, these traditional works were captured by the American, like intellectualism and spirituality in 1820s and 1830s were also practiced by the Britishers. So there was a parallel cross match between the American writers and between the British writers. But a core belief of the transcendentalism is that the inherent goodness of the people and nature. So adherents at that time, the followers at that time, think that the society and its institutions have corrupted the purity of the individual, and they have faith that people are at their best when truly self-reliant and independent. So there was a type of mindset in the people that the transcendentalism emphasizes the subjective intuition over the objective empiricism. Adherents believes that the individuals are capable of generating the completely original insight with the little attention and difference past masters. So that's why this movement was followed by the people, and it has a deep effect on the people of America, on the American poetry, on the poets of America, and above all on the literature and literary genres of the poetry and American literature. Some of the poets of 19th century were Ralph Waldo Emerson from 1803 to 1882, Edgar Allan Poe 1809 to 1849, Henry David Thoreau 1817 to 1862, Sidney Lanier 1842 to 1881, and James Whitcomb Riley 1849 to 1916. I will talk about Edgar Allan Poe, who was a soul of the American poetry. As might be expected, the works of all these writers are united by a common search for the distinctive American voice to distinguish them from their British contemporaries and counterparts. So that's why, because I have said earlier that it was a parallel type of journey from both of the nations, from Britishers and from Americans, and it was an imitation, a permanent imitation, a continuous imitation from the both of the nation. That's why they are called the counterparts of each other. So the Americans explored the landscape and the traditions of their native country as materials for their poetry. So, what was the material for their poetry? There were basically imitations, the new subjects, the native life of the America, the rules and regulations of the America, the political influences of the America, and above all the natural things, which is evergreen type of themes and subject matters for the poetry. Now we talk about the peak of American poetry. At the time when T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost, Ezra Pound, and E.E. Cumming were writing the poetry, the American poetry was at its best. Though much of the American poetry published between 1910 and 1945 remains lost the pages of small circulation political periodicals, particularly the ones on the far left, destroyed by the librarians during the 1950s McCarthy era. So after Second World War, the American poetry penetrated in the pens of the poets, and they wrote down the golden words, and American poetry reached at its peak. So some of the writers and poets I have told to you, you can see that these poets has great influence on the poetry of all over the world. So the received narrative of the modernism proposes that Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot were perhaps the most influential modernist English language poets in the period during the World War I. But after World War I and basically after World War II, it was at its best. So the period between World War I and World War II is a grooming and peak period of American poetry, and after World War II, it was at its level best. It was nothing like anything from the American poets. So let's talk about the subject matters and themes of the American poetry. As you all know that the evergreen themes of the American poetry are nature. As we can see, number of writer has written down on nature. So other themes are the poets primary subjects and themes were the domestic life, the village life, or the rural life, and similarly some parts too, somehow the town life and the city life, the domestic life, the personal life of the people, how the individual thinks, what is the individualism, how the thoughts varies from person to person, from society to society also. And after that the mythology, different myths which were penetrating at that time in American society were discussed in a great deal. Politics of the United States, that is an important theme of the American poetry, and the number of the poets were indulged directly in the politics of the United States. The other theme is nature, then modernity, as we all know that the Americans used to call them modern. They thought that they are far away from the other nation. They are the superior one. That's why they thought that they are the modern than us. And human rights, and they apparently, I personally think that they recognize themselves as the representative of the human rights. They call themselves and they influence the human rights very well. After that, let's start the second part of our lecture. The second part consists of the Robert Frost as an American poet. We will go through the in detail from the Robert Frost as an American poet. His full name was Robert Lee Frost, was born on 26th March 1874 and was died on 29th January 1963. He was a well recognized, the most famous American poet and one of the world's best poets ever. His work was initially published in England before it was published in America. So that was a part of England and also from the New England and also in the state of the Vermont, because Vermont and New England are the states of United States of America. So known were his realistic depictions of the rural life and his command of the American colloquial speeches. So those speeches which were influencing at that time and people were pretty much impressed from those speeches, he has used them in his poetry, because poetry only penetrates and cultivates in the mind of the people of the contemporary society only when we use the common things and the common genuine issues of that time. Frost frequently wrote about settings from the rural life in New England in the early 20th century. He wrote his poetry by using the words and verses to examine the complex social and the philosophical themes. The number of social themes are here in the poetry of Robert Frost, and also when it reaches towards the philosophical level, it is nearly ununderstandable by the people. Okay, now remember the obscurity of Browning, because the same case was with Browning, who was a British poet. Robert Browning used to examine such things from the social parameters that it was in such a way philosophical that it was nearly to ununderstandable by the reader. But while in case of the Robert Frost, the philosophical themes touches to the mind in so depth that we are at the crazy all that, and we definitely speak in the praise of Robert Frost because he has such a diversity in his topicalization. He has such purity in his social narratives, and above all, he has depth in his philosophical themes. So, distinctions and awards on his credits: being a famous poet, being a world famous poet, and the main thing is that when a poet becomes famous in his own lifetime, so that is something to be recognized about any person as a poet. Frost was basically honored frequently during his lifetime and is the only poet. He is the sole poet to receive the four Pulitzer Prizes for poetry. He was given four times and he was nominated for a number of times for the Pulitzer Prizes, but he won the Pulitzer Prizes for four times. And because he was a poet laureate of the America, basically the state of Vermont, that's why he was in a duty to perform such type of literary practices which were beneficial for the United States of America, basically and especially for the state of Vermont. Beg pardon. He became one of the America's rare public literary figure, almost an artistic institution. So, a person having a number of literary works on his credit and practiced by the people, and basically at the genuinely government level, he becomes an institution of that time. So he was not only a man, but he was an institution of poetry, and not only an institution but an artistic institution. What does it mean that? It means that he was not only a poet but a born artist, I would say about him. He was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal in 1960 for his poetic works, and the Congressional Gold Medal is one of the best award given from the American government to any civil person or any person of the America. On July 22, 1961, Frost was named as Poet Laureate of Vermont, which is the state of United States of America. So let's see his notable works. There is no doubt that Frost's most famous poems include The Gift Outright and Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, one of the most famous poem which has the number of poetical devices, the number of personifications, the deep meanings, the in-depth meanings, the social criticism, social life, and he has touching above all the philosophical level of his writing. And what is the summary of this poem? All we have read about the summary of stopping by woods on a snowy evening in matriculation. And after that, there was Birches, one of the most important and famous poem of Robert Frost. And after that, there is Mending Wall, such a splendid work of Robert Frost, in which he used to describe the people that why these borders are here to separate the peoples of our societies, the borders of religion, the borders of culture, the border and barriers of language, the borders of thoughts, the borders of even hate, and the different wars which are nowadays we can see that people are in the internal wars and external wars, internal conflicts and external conflicts. So in Mending Wall, Robert Frost told us that there is no need of walls. There shouldn't be any wall because I don't like the wall. And why I don't like the wall? Because I don't like the separation. Why we are going to separate the people on the name of nations, on the name of religions, on the name of aggressions, on the name of socio-political wars, on the names of politics. So that is the poem, one of the brilliant poem of the Robert Frost, Mending Wall. After that, The Road Not Taken is a decent way to tell the people about the choices we made in our life And what kind of choices these are, that we can't decide it is we can't decide in both ways, that either we should go for the right path or either we should go for the left path. Which is the part which will lead us towards our destination? This is the poem which describes us, those emotions which a person feels at that time, the road not taken. And the next one was Nothing Gold Can Stay. In this poem, Robert Frost want to tell us that nature has its different colors, but the gold is not a color which will stay. Like all that glitters are not gold. And similarly, the acquainted with the night. Today, the topic of our discussion will be acquainted with the night. We will discuss it after having a look upon the biography of Robert Frost. So, Robert Frost's death, when he was died on 29 January 1963. And the reason of his death was complications related to the prostate surgery. That was a major surgery, but because he was in old age at that time, he got fame, he got so much political works, he got all that a person could want in his own life. So that's why he had left all the memories of his life to us. And his last funeral ceremonies were performed by two of his daughters, Leslie and Irma. Leslie was his eldest daughter, and Irma was his younger daughter. And his ashes are interred in family plot in Bennington, Vermont. So he was basically in the form of ashes was buried in Vermont. A great poet, a great end, but it is a bitter reality of our life that nothing gold can stay. I have quoted the topic of his own poetry, the topic of his own verses, the topic of his own poem, that nothing gold can stay. The thing which is precious to us, that was a great loss for the American poetry and above all for the English and American literature. That was a great loss for us as being the student of literature and students of poetry. So, better poet, bitter ending, a good poet, fantastic poet, and above all, one of the most American famous poets, one of the most famous American poets. So, let's see the Acquainted with the Night. And first, we will analyze its text. What are the textual parameters which will describe us about the summary of Acquainted with the Night and its poetical devices, and having some kind of explanation, I will describe all these lines given here to you. And what are the meanings in by the acquainted? Acquainted means to know about something, to have a frankness with something, to having a complete view of anything. Here the night has been represented, that it means that poet want to describe from the title to us that he had known all about the night. He do know about the right night, that what kind of things the night is going to describe him. So he describes the night in his own words. Basically, it is a lonesome journey of the poet in a night. So let's see the first lines. I have been back in rain. I have been out from my house, and I was coming back in rain to my house. And what I have observed, I have observed that nobody has observed me. I have observed that what the night offers to me instead of darkness, but darkness gloominess, griefs, loneliness. Darkness symbolizes here basically the internal sadness of the speaker, the internal sadness of the poet. So, in third and fourth line, he describes that I have outwalked saddest city lane. I have come out from my home. I have walked about the city lane, and the city lane is looking pretty much gloomy, saddest. It is basically one of the lane which can be seen that nobody is roaming there. Nobody is out of his or her house. Why this saddest city land has captured the poet's attention towards it? The reason is only that it represents the calmness. But where there is a sadness, there is a lack of calmness. Why lack of calmness? Because in sadness, every person wants some kind of calmness. He wants to eject out from himself or herself from this situation. So that's why the acquainted with the night symbolizes here that, explains to us here that the only person who has visited the city lane, the saddest city lane of his city, he has coming out of his house, out of his home, and observing all around, but there is nothing, instead of saddest expression of inward in the poet and outward in the city. So let's have a take a look on fifth and sixth line. I have passed, unwilling to explain. What the poet is going to do, what the speaker is going to do, that he says that I am going to pass from the lane and I do nothing. I couldn't explain the situation at that time which I have felt in that saddest city lane. Why? Because I have observed their nothingness. There was nothing in that city, that was empty, like inward from the speaker. As the speaker is empty inside in his mind, that he is wandering out of his home in loneliness and without any purpose, without any reason, without any prior type of determination. There is no determination behind his roaming in the city lanes. So he thought that I have stood, I was standing there, an interrupted cry, and he listened. Some kind of voice from the other part of the city, from the other city lane, from the other street of city, came over houses or say goodbye. So here he wants to describe that some people, some person is here, like poet, he is standing here in this city lane, and some person is standing there, a person is standing there in the other city lane, and that person, maybe he is saying goodbye to someone, or he is coming over toward the house, or there is another matter of discussion there. So that's why he says that when he was interrupted by a cry, when his mind was interrupted by a loud voice or shriek, then he thought that there would be somebody else instead of him. But that wasn't basically that wasn't truth. It might be an illusion. Maybe that the poet has listened the voice from inside of house of some people, or maybe it is in the street, but he doesn't know from where the voice is coming, which is now in going in his ears, and further still against the sky. So I again set my mind, and I again thought and reflected, and now towards the sky I see. What I see there the moon, which is the lunar clock, and it isn't telling me the right time. And he says that I should not be out of my house. I should be inward of my house. So that's why I thought to express the feelings in my mind that I shouldn't be out of house. So I thought to look towards the sky, proclaim the time with the night. So I proclaimed the time from the sun, and I thought that at the end that I am the only person who is acquainted with the night. I do know about that. I know the night better than any person because I am out of my house and nobody is out of house. I am now familiar with the night, that what night offers. It only offers the darkness. But there is a source of hope. There is a source of pleasure for the poet that he has seen the moon at that time, and it is a parallel contribution and parallel conflict of the pessimistic thoughts and optimistic thoughts. So I have shortened the text of this poem. You may read it along with in the description box. So these are some major important lines of Acquainted with the Night. So let's see its interpretations. First of all, we analyze the summary of Acquainted with the Night. Who is the speaker at that time? The speaker is a normal human being who want to know the night, who thoughts that he has all the informations about the night. So the speaker declares their familiarity with the night, that he is familiar with the night. He knows that what darkness offers to him. It was raining when the speaker began a walk across the city, and it was still raining at the end of the walk. During the walk, the speaker progressed beyond even to the outermost light of the city. The outermost light of the city once again symbolizes the hope. Once again, it is a parallel connection between the optimistic thoughts and the pessimistic thoughts. So the speaker looked towards the most desolate city street. The speaker also passed by a watchman patrolling the city. The speaker, however, looked down to avoid the eye contact with the watchman. The speaker doesn't want to make any type of eye contact with that watchman. Why? Why not wanting to talk about the reasons behind the speaker's nighttime walk? That if that watchman may ask him that why he is out of from his house at that particular time of night, then what is the answer of the poet or the speaker at that time? What should the speaker told to the watchman if he asked him any one question related to his wandering or his roaming at the city lanes in the night? So during his walk, the speaker stopped moving upon hearing the distinct broken off cry. The sound of this own human voice traveled across the houses from the different streets. So he couldn't make any type of decision that either that voice was coming from any house or either that voice was coming from any street or outside the house. So, however, the voice didn't call the speaker to come back or bid the speakers farewell. Even more distant, that the higher up the moon shines like a bright clock in the sky. So when his eye was on the moon, that also represents some type of hope. The inward feeling of the poet that the in darkness he is seeing the light, as the darkness symbolizes the gloominess and lightness symbolizes the hope here. So this metaphorical clock declares that the time is not wrong or right. This clock says that either this is a right time to get out of house or either it is a wrong time to be out of house. There should be an opinion of the poet that he should came back towards the home. So the speaker again says that they are familiar with the night, that he is basically the one who knows the night better. He knew the night better. He is familiarized with the night better. Now let's have a look upon the setting of acquainted with the night. The setting of acquainted with the night is a city during the night time. We particularly can see that, as he has described, the poet has described to us that he was wandering in a city lane. It means that the capturization of this poetry was done in any type of city. So the streets are for the most part deserted, perhaps in part due to the constant rain. Certain parts of the city are illuminated with the light, while the others are not. It means that again there is a parallel connection between the optimism and pessimism, optimistic thoughts and pessimistic thoughts, that some of the parts are in darkness and some of the parts are in the light. It means that in some parts there is a gloominess, there is a you can see that sadness, and in some of the parts there is a hope, there is a happiness also. So overhead the occasional a human voice calls out into the night. Overhead the moon shines brightly but offers no comfort or solace to the viewer. The speaker is totally influenced from the moon, but he sees it as a hopeful depiction from the nature. So together this collection of the details indicates that the city is not any particular city, rather its details are the particular enough to evoke a sense of sorrow and isolation. And these are also a major theme of the major themes of this poem, Acquainted with the Night, yet vague enough to apply to many cities around the world. As a result, many readers can relate it to the speaker's experience of walking throughout his enormous city. Now, this city may be any city which is not named after, which is not nominated in this poem, and there is no need to nominate this city because all the information are vague up to something. All the informations are in gloominess, and the informations provided by the poet to us only describes that to us that the sorrowfulness of that time, the isolation, the loneliness, the wandering trip of the poet. And poet want to describe us his inward situations of what is right and what is wrong. For example, when the poet thought that he should go back to home, then he saw the moon there out of home, and he couldn't decide what is right and what is wrong. Either it is a right time or either it is a wrong time to be out of home. So next up we are analyzing the poetic devices used in this poem. So there are basically number of poetic devices, but I have selected the three poetic devices here, that the anaphora, assonance and irony. The first one, the anaphora, it refers to the repetition of any words or expression. In this poem we have gone through the definition of anaphora. Frost has repeated the word rain in the second line of the poem to emphasize his point of view. Why the repetition of the words is important? It is important due to emphasizeness on the words. When any writer want to emphasize his own thoughts and words, he do make the repetition in the words. In other words, the anaphora is used to influence something, to emphasize point of view, or to give attention towards a basic type of thought. Now assonance, the second point, assonance is the repetition of the vowel sounds in the same line, such as the sounds of I and in I have walked out in rain and back in rain. What he describes to us that When the repetition in the vowel sounds or the assonance has been described to us in that, the purpose of this description is to tell the listener or to tell the reader that there is nothing easy for the poet, that he is out from the house in rain and back to the house in rain. So there is a kind of comparison between his thoughts and the thoughts of readers, that the poet is describing through assonance his own thoughts and pinning point his own thoughts in the mind of the reader, that it is not a sense of easiness, it is not a time of ease at that time when the poet is out of his home. The third one is the irony. The cruel irony of his acquaintance with the night surfaces with the poem, circles back to repeats its opening line, which now begins to implicate the real state of the human conditions with the state of darkness itself. They are reciprocally complementary. So these complements and reciprocals tells us that at first time we come to know about the poet that either he is going out of home willingly, but irony of that time and place is that he is unwillingly going out of home, that he doesn't want to left the home, but he is acquainted with the gloominess and darkness and his sad realities of the life, the isolation of the life. So that's why he is going out of home, and the state of darkness begins to figure living without. So that kind of state of darkness prevails everywhere, and we come to know that why the poet is emphasizing to be out of house at that time of darkness, at that time of night, and why the poet wants the gloominess in his life. Either he shouldn't be out of home, but because he is standing in the saddest city lane, so there is some kind of relief to him, that as his inward life and the inward thoughts are sad, as the poet is sad inwardly, isolated inwardly from his soul, same is the case outward in the world, that he is standing in the saddest city lane. So that is irony of time, irony of place, and above all the irony of comparative things here, that the reader is understanding all the situations of the poet, and there is a philosophy in it. What kind of philosophy is there, we are going to discuss in the major themes. So after a thorough discussion of acquainted with the night, we can analyze that the main theme in this poem is about depression and isolation, and reveals that isolating yourself from the people and your feelings can cause an individual to experience the depression and loneliness, leading to life of unhappiness. So apparently we can see that all these things leads us towards the gloominess, towards the sadness. What? The first point, the depression. What is the depression? Depression is the situational mindset, that when a worried state of mind, when a person isn't feeling easy or happy. The second one is isolation. Isolation means that loneliness. The poet is lonesome, as we can see that the speaker in the whole of the poem is isolated inwardly and outwardly, that he is not only broken from inside of his heart but also from outside of his body. So he is not at the mind mapping that he could feel happy at that time. And isolation itself is basically a form of gloominess. And isolation itself is unhappiness to all the people. When people get isolation, only when they are in the form of sadness. When a person is happy, he will enjoy the gatherings, but when a person is unhappy, he will isolate himself or herself. So now the feeling can cause the individual to experience depression. This is only a type of feeling when people come to know across such kind of situations which leads towards the unhappiness of the life. And it is a bitter reality that life is not a bed of roses, it is a bed of thorns. There are certain pits and bumps in the life felt which we felt in our daily works also, in our daily feelings also, that sometime a person is happy, but sometime that same person may be in unhappy conditions, in depression, in loneliness, in a mental fade, in isolation. And the other themes discussed in this poem are sorrow and despair. So these are some of the major themes, and we'll talk about the philosophical parameters of this poem, that Robert Frost is touching the philosophy of human life, that what type of philosophy should be followed by the people who are living life. There should be take it easy way. What the take it easy way? That in the form of isolation, unhappiness, there should be any point in our mind to be happy. Like little things can make us happy, little deeds of goodness can make us happy. These are the things which the poet want to describe us unwillingly, that he want to describe us that because life is full of gloominess, sadness, isolation, depression, sorrow, despair, loneliness, which leads towards the happiness. So there should be a corner in our life to enjoy our life, to have a better look, positively look our life, to check our life such an in a happiness way, in a form of happiest ways. So that's why the poet is right to describe the loneliness of his speaker. Now you can follow the references which I have mentioned here for further studies, and if you have any question related to today's topic, you can pinpoint it in the comments box. You can ask to me any question if you have in your mind, and hope that you have understand today's topic. That's why I am leaving now my lecture, and hopefully that you have understand all the things. But if there is any type of problem in your mindset, and if you think that there is a problem in the topic, kindly do ask me any question. So that's it from today's lecture. Stay home, stay safe, and goodbye from me. Thanks a lot.